All right, I should be live. If I am, please let me know in the chat because otherwise I just don't know if I'm really alive or not. Otherwise, we'll also say, welcome to another Monday night where we can talk about some of the escalatory situations occurring around the world right now and why you should be motivated to be better prepared. It does seem that the signal is beginning to come through. I have 5x5s popping in. Hudson Valley Prepping and Survival says 5x5. Good to see you. Make sure you check out their channel as well if you're into preparedness. Cold Reality, Porky Prepper 5x9, my favorite. And then we also have Sherman Sales 19x11. We know which World War you're a big fan of. We also have Joan T with the 5x5 and Acnaut 2099 5x5 Wolverines. I think we're sounding good and hopefully to a certain degree looking good. And by that I mean camera quality. So thanks for being here. What's the title of tonight's live stream? Russian retaliation imminent, NATO blame for multiple attacks, new war front opens up in the Middle East. And this is what's happening right now, and the reason we have to pay attention to these things is because, well, they can affect our lives very quickly, and the way SHTF seems to work out is that it's slow and then fast, right? So I do want to mention Midway USA is the biggest supporter of the channel. Thanks to them, I can do live streams like this one. I can get on here and tell you about things that are occurring, and then anything relevant to preparedness that you might need in the sense of equipment, make sure you check them out because they do support the channel and the community directly. And then also the live streams are specifically sponsored by MagicPrepperBeef.com, which is where you can get long-term shelf-stable high quality beef products, right? So this is sous vide, ribeye steak, New York strip, filet mignon. It's pretty much whatever you want when it comes to having a steak in the apocalypse. It'll last minimum 10 years on the shelf, most likely up to 25. It has no ingredients at all. You will literally have to add salt because it needs flavor because it has no other ingredients, but that's okay because you can dress it up however you'd like. And of course, if you use the code MAGICPREPPER, you get 15% off, which you will want to do because this is expensive product, but it is high quality. It's a luxury item. If you don't have food stored away, this is not for you. This is to supplement your current survival food storage pantry. Okay, and that's magicpepperbeef.com. It's also where I like to talk trash about my enemies, all right? So, let's get going. And I have a few of those, don't worry, but they don't know I exist, so it's okay. We have awesome mods here tonight. We have Alaskan Ballistics. Good to see you. We also have USMC Devil Dog 0311. It's great to see you as well. We also have Exile Reviews. Hello to you. Alaskan Ballistics, I know you're discussing the support of the NRA instead of GOA and FPC, and the thing we have to keep in mind is that those are decades-long relationships that just aren't going to change. And believe me, I've had conversations about it, and it is what it is, let's just say. So, but I understand, and I think many of them understand as well. So, hey, hi from Bismarck says, old woman. Well, good to see you, and thanks for being a neighbor, because even if you're very far away from me, we're still neighbors. What's going on with the whole Russian situation? Well, here's what we need to know. This is what we need to talk about, and it is, well, maybe not as crazy as it could be, but we don't know. And what we're going to do tonight, we're going to talk about why this retaliatory measure is in the works. Then we're going to talk about what might be the most likely response, especially in the sense of trying to maintain some level of decorum when it comes to international relations. And what could be a response that might affect us here in the US or anywhere else where we have Americans. That's more likely in the sense of having less liability, let's just say. And of course, there's always like the big grandiose retaliation, but I don't believe that's what we're going to see because I don't think we've crossed the Rubicon quite yet. So that's what we're going to speculate on because it's important to kind of have an idea of what could happen. And then you have your trigger mechanisms in place when it comes to your preparedness planning for how you'll react to that exact situation. So Russia promises retaliation against the US for Ukraine's strike, okay? Now, the strike was on Crimea. Ukraine considers Crimea their territory. Russia considers it their territory. This is why it's an interesting situation, but here we are, okay? This is from June 24th, today. The Kremlin on Monday squarely blamed the United States for an attack on Crimea with U.S.-supplied ATACMS missiles that had killed at least 4 people and injured 151. And Moscow formally warned the U.S. ambassador that retaliation would follow. So they're saying there will be retaliation. We don't know what it is yet. I'm going to give you some ideas about what it could be, and we'll see what happens. The war in Ukraine has deepened a crisis in relations between Russia and the West, and Russian officials have said the conflict is entering the most dangerous escalation to date. But directly blaming the United States for an attack on Crimea, which Russia unilaterally annexed in 2014, although most of the world considers it part of Ukraine, is a step further. You should ask my colleagues in Europe and above all in Washington, the press secretaries, why their governments are killing Russian children. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov told reporters. At least 2 children were killed in the attack on Sevastopol on Sunday. According to Russian officials, people were shown running from a beach near Sevastopol and some of the injured being carried off on sun loungers. Kiev did not comment on the attack. Russia said the United States has supplied the weapons while the U.S. military had aimed them and provided data. Russia's foreign ministry summoned U.S. Ambassador Lynn Tracy and told her Washington was waging a hybrid war against Russia and has actually become a party to the conflict. Retaliatory measures will definitely follow, it said. Tracy said Washington regretted any loss to civilian life. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller told reporters, adding that Washington provides weapons to Ukraine so it can defend its sovereign territory, including Crimea. Pentagon spokesperson Major Charlie Dietz said that Ukraine makes its own targeting decisions and conducts its own military operations. President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly warned of the risk of a much broader war involving the world's biggest nuclear powers, although he has said Russia does not want a conflict with the U.S.-led NATO alliance. Okay? Now, Putin presents the Ukraine war as part of a wider struggle with the U.S., which he says ignored Moscow's interests after the Soviet Union's 1991 breakup, then plotted to split Russia apart and seize its natural resources. Leaders of the West and Ukraine have cast the war as an imperial-style land grab. The West denies wanting to destroy Russia, which in turn denies intending to invade any NATO member states. Okay. After the United States allowed Ukraine to direct some U.S. weapons into Russia, the Kremlin sent signals that it viewed this as a serious escalation. And here's some of the things that people are concerned about, but in my opinion, probably unlikely when it comes to retaliation, but definitely something to consider as a possibility, because it's definitely not impossible. Putin has ordered drills to practice deployment of tactical nuclear weapons, suggested Russia could station conventional missiles within striking distance of the United States and its allies, and sealed a mutual defense pact with North Korea. Okay? Washington still prohibits Kiev from striking recognized Russian territory with ATACMS, which have a range of up to 186 miles, and other long-range U.S. weapons. Now, be aware of the fact that Russia thinks Crimea is Russia. So, to them, that dictate from the U.S. isn't actually applied. Putin said on Thursday Russia might supply weapons to North Korea in what he suggested would be a like-for-like response to the Western arming of Ukraine. Asked for what the Russian answer would be to the attack in Crimea, Peskov recalled Putin's words on June 6th about wider placement of conventional weapons. Of course, the involvement of the United States in the fighting as a result of which peaceful Russians are dying cannot but have consequences, Peskov said. Which ones exactly, time will tell. So, there's a lot of things that could happen based on those words and this rhetoric, right? A lot of people are obviously concerned about what Russia may or may not do. So we're going to try to take the more level-headed approach about what would be a likely thing for them to start doing in the sense of retaliations and what we've seen over the last few years the West actually partake in, which I think is likely to kind of see Russia follow in the same step. But we can't table the idea that they won't do something more egregious. And we're going to go over some of those likelihoods as well, okay? So I did miss a couple of super chats here. Nick, a lot of other prep channels are slowing down or calling quits. Please keep pushing. I know it's a lot of work. Well, I appreciate that. I'm going to keep going, but that's also why my content's pretty diverse, because I have to maintain interest, and I know everyone gets burnt out on the doom and gloom and everything else related to current events and preparedness. So I try to keep things, let's just say, diversified, right? And then also, Nick, with the Let's Go People Show some donation love. Well, I appreciate that, but it's definitely not required. All of you being here is definitely helpful. But if you do want to help me out and don't want to donate, at least hit the like button or subscribe. Any of those things could really help the channel big time. And then Hudson Valley Prepping and Survival says, thank you for keeping us informed, Magic Prepper. You are appreciated. Well, I appreciate you too, and I'm glad you guys are involved in the community, 100%. Nick, matching donations now. All right. It's getting crazy in here. Okay, so here's one thing I want to mention is that with this World War III type situation, I mean, we're talking about asymmetrical warfare. We're talking about the possibility of anything occurring, right? Cyber attacks, underwater cables being cut. I mean, a million things could happen. We don't exactly know what the retaliation could be. What's the most measured, right? I could get right into like the most crazy, but that might get more people excited, right? But we should take measured approaches as people who are involved in preparedness because, panic doesn't ever make good decisions, does it? And we want to maintain our calm while we move through these situations in order to, come out on top. So here's something that was mentioned just 5 days ago, before this attack occurred. Okay, so it kind of gives you an idea of what could be happening, especially based on the fact that the West recently announced that we're willing to start seizing Russian assets. Okay, Russia says it has plenty of scope to retaliate. Keyword, right? Over a plan to seize income from its assets. Okay. Russia has significant amounts of Western assets and property on its territory that could be targets for retaliation by Moscow if the West seizes income from Russian assets, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said on Wednesday. The leaders of the Group of Seven, G7, agreed at a summit in Italy last week to use interest from Russian assets frozen in the West to provide a $50 billion loan to Ukraine. So, like I said, this is from 5 days ago, prior to the attack, prior to Russia saying that there will be a retaliation for the attack, which has been talked about in the past. So this line was crossed. There was a line that was put there. It's not our job to decide if it should or should not be crossed, but it is a line that was there, so we have to anticipate something occurring. But this seems to me like what might be one of the most likely channels that they'll use, right? Russia says the action is illegal and will rebound against the West by undermining confidence in the global financial system. Interesting. Our country has significant amounts of Western funds and property that are under Russian jurisdiction. All of this may be subject to Russian retaliatory policies and retaliatory actions, Zakharova told reporters. There's a lot of talk about retaliation here in this article, right? And so just trying to be level-headed and not panic about Russia's going to nuke everybody. This seems to be a course of action they're very likely to take, let's just say, right? So, of course, no one will disclose the nature of these retaliatory actions to you, but the arsenal of political and economic countermeasures is wide. Economists, not economists, but economists, lawyers, and experts say one of Russia's most likely actions would be to confiscate foreign investors' financial assets, okay? Which, obviously, I don't know why this video is playing, but it bothers me, is a problem because lots of foreign investors are probably here in the U.S., so just be aware of that, okay? And securities currently held in special Type C accounts to which access has been blocked since the start of the war unless Moscow grants a waiver. Some $260 billion or euros and $281 billion in Russian assets such as a central bank reserve have been frozen under sanctions imposed over Moscow's war in Ukraine. Around 190 billion euros of the assets are held in Euroclear, a Belgium-based central securities depository. Okay, so Zakharova said Russia had received direct signals from some G7 countries that they would not take part in such action because they understand the costs that will be extremely painful. And she did not name the countries or provide further detail to substantiate that assertion. So just based on what happened 5 days ago, prior to the attack in Sevastopol, it sounds like Russia is willing to attack economically, right? Which is what the West has been doing for quite some time. So in that same vein, we know there's other things that they could do. And we're going to talk about that too, especially things that they might be able to wash their hands clean of, things that might not be easily traced back to them, right? Things of that nature, which the reason I'm bringing that up is because of recent events and because of the likelihood of certain threats being in our country based on our wide open southern border and our wide open northern border, which, by the way, in case you're new here, has more encounters with people who are on the terror watch list than the southern border. So just be aware of that, even though the majority of people are coming from the southern border, right? So that's something you should always keep in mind, especially if you're in a northern state. But here's the thing. These threats exist, and we should at least take them seriously. And as someone who wants to be prepared, these are threats that you can actually do a little bit about when it comes to your personal protection. So that's why I want to bring it up, because it's hard for us to do much about Russia deciding to launch hypersonic missiles, right? I don't see that coming, but it's possible. I just don't assume that's what we're going to see. I think that the financial implications of assets being frozen or property being seized or anything like that is maybe like the most likely approach they'll take, knowing that it won't have a conventional reaction, right? It won't have a kinetic reaction in the sense of weaponry being used. But it is Russia, and they've been dealing with this stuff for quite a while, and they've been saying a lot of things about crossing lines for quite some time, so they might go big or go home. And so these are things that we have to consider. So what just happened? What's an example of something that could happen here? And what's an example of Russia being upset and then possibly wanting to move forward with a tit for tat? And we'll explain that after we go over this story that just occurred in, well, a part of Russia, a part of the Russian Federation anyway, we'll say. Dagestan, okay? In case you weren't aware, there was a large-scale attack, not a huge attack. It wasn't like what happened on October 7th in Israel, but it is still a pretty egregious attack that occurred in this region. Now, this region is very unstable in many ways. It's not economically viable in some ways, right? It's like, it's a problematic area, but there are some interesting things coming out of this in the sense of how Russia's looking at it, which could tell you some things that you might expect as an American, especially in the sense of how many warnings we're getting about possible terror activity. And we're going to talk about how that's applied to other places as well here too. Gunmen in Russia's Dagestan attack religious sites and police posts, killing at least 20. Okay? Here's the latest update, just so we can have the numbers straight. According to the latest information from Dagestan's health ministry, 20 people were killed and 46 people were injured in the attacks. Earlier, Russia's investigative committee reported on the deaths of 15 police officers and 4 civilians. Dagestan Governor Sergei Melikov reported that 6 of the suspected attackers were killed during the subsequent counterterrorism operation. Okay. In the city of Derbent, gunmen opened fire on the Orthodox Church of the Intercession of the Holy Virgin, reported the Telegram channel Baza. Witnesses described hearing gunfire and seeing smoke rising from around the church. Dagestan's Interior Ministry confirmed that both the Orthodox Church and a synagogue in Derbent were attacked with automatic weapons around 6 p.m. local time. The attackers reportedly fled in a white Volkswagen Polo. Videos shared on Telegram show the burning synagogue and damaged police vehicles. Now, one thing I want to just mention here, and this is just based on things that we've seen here in the United States and things that have happened in the sense of terror plots being foiled by the FBI and everything else. Religious sites are consistently targeted by these types of attacks. And if you're someone who goes to church or goes to synagogue or goes to mosque or whatever you do, right? Because I don't know your life. But if you go to a religious facility and worship with large groups of worshipers, you should be aware of the fact that it's been proven time and time again that these places are considered targets by certain groups of people. And if you're going to do what you need to do based on your religion, right, which is go to your place of worship, which is something that you should probably be doing, then you need to consider your personal security while doing so. And I'm not going to tell you what you can or can't do because I don't know the rules of your place. I don't know the rules of your state or your city or anything else, right? But what I do know is that I don't go to church without levels of personal security, let's just say, okay? So there's something to remind ourselves with when it comes to these things. Religious facilities are targeted regularly, okay? Now, we're not going to go through video or anything like that. It's not going to go well when it comes to that, okay? Around the same time, a fire broke out at a synagogue in the regional capital, Makhachkalaka. Something like that. It's Makhachkala. Sorry, I just couldn't help myself. Videos from the scene show smoke billowing from the synagogue's third-floor windows. The local Interior Ministry branch then reported that armed men had also attacked a police post. Footage from the Makhachkala shows gunmen in black clothing shooting at passing police cars with automatic weapons. Okay? And this is the kind of stuff that you see happening in places even as close as Mexico, right? When it comes to cartel violence with the police. Like, so this isn't unheard of in the Western Hemisphere. Like, this isn't necessarily something we're shielded from because we're far away. This is an example of these groups that are willing to do these things in different places. The place could be your place next time. We just don't know. And I'm bringing this up because we've heard things from Russia regarding this that should give you some concerns about the possible use of asymmetric warfare and the possible use of an event like this as a retaliatory measure, okay? Especially as a retaliatory measure that might not be able to be traced back to those who are pulling the strings. According to information from Daghestan's Interior Ministry, 6 police officers were killed in the attacks and another 12 were wounded. Baza wrote that a civilian in the Derbent synagogue was also killed. The Muftiat of Dagestan reported 9 deaths, including 7 police officers and 25 people injured. Father Nikolai, a 66-year-old Orthodox priest, was killed during the attack on the church in Derbent, reported Russia's National Anti-Terrorism Committee. The Anti-Terrorism Committee also announced the implementation of a counter-terrorist operation regime in Dagestan to ensure the safety of citizens, suppress terrorist acts, and apprehend those involved in the armed attacks. In turn, Russia's investigative committee announced that it had launched criminal probes on charges of terrorist acts. Okay? And be aware of the fact that implementing a counter-terrorist operation regime in Dagestan is something that you should expect here in the United States when it comes to anything that's large scale. The regime being whatever law enforcement or even National Guard / military entity decides to return to peace and maintain the peace thereafter. If you get what I'm putting down, I guess, okay? So this was a pretty serious attack. I mean, that's a lot of people to perish, and it was something that was a little bit, let's just say, surprising, but also in an unstable part of the region. So here's where it gets weird. You knew we were going to do something weird, right? Of course, of course. And let's see here. I just want to make sure I'm not missing anybody here in the chat. Jay Gobolos, thanks for your reporting. Well, you're welcome. And thanks for being here. I really appreciate the support, 100%. It's not Ivan coming through the southern border. It's Jose and Mugambi, says Yardbirds. Okay. All right. Well, if that's who it is. And then we also have Paradise Acres is here. I'm glad to see you. And we have Gunslinger 67. Oh, that's where Dags come from. There you go. We also have Savage Lee here as well. So, very good to see everybody tonight. Now, why is this so weird? Because Russia is already claiming that there was some sort of NATO involvement with that attack. Now, it's pretty easy to assume that a relatively unstable region that has a lot of political and religious strife might just spawn events like that based on probability and based on tension, right? But we're going to throw out something a little bit crazy here in a second, okay? But here we are. Russia pins Dagestan attack on Ukraine, ignoring religious tensions, okay? I'm not saying it, they're saying it. Okay. On this special day, 66-year-old Father Nikolai was in church in the city of Derbent, Dagestan. Located in Russia's North Caucasus region, Dagestan is a predominantly Muslim republic, but Derbent is known as the city of 3 religions. It's one of the oldest Christian centers in Russia and home to an ancient Jewish community. Both were about to be attacked in the most brutal fashion. On Sunday evening, gunmen stormed the church and murdered Father Nikolai. They also attacked the local synagogue, setting it on fire. And this was on Trinity Sunday, which is why they're saying it was such an important day. Okay. Around the same time, insurgents were also on a rampage in Makhachkala, the capital of Dagestan, targeting a church and synagogue there too. Faced with this dramatic, coordinated attack, security forces launched an anti-terrorist operation. In Dagestan, gun battles raged long into the night. At least 5 of the attackers were killed. Okay. One thing to keep in mind when looking at an attack like this is that it didn't take a lot of attackers to pull off something that was pretty wide scale, right? Like this wasn't a major operation. This wasn't 1,000 guys pouring over the border to try to create massive disruption. This was not very many people able to pull this off, which is a big reason why we should be considering all the risks and all the threats we have here in our own country at this point in time. Okay, the immediate suspicion links to Islamist extremism. After all, not long ago, Dagestan was a hotbed of extremism and that had spilled over from neighboring Chechnya. Okay, now, that all makes sense. Like I said, there's a good reason to believe that this could have just spawned organically there based on this or that. Now, let's get down to where Russia is blaming Ukraine, aka NATO, for some of this, okay? When Russian MP Abdulakim Gadziev went on Russian state TV to comment on Sunday's bloodshed, he had a very different explanation for what had happened. Mr. Gadziev suggested that the intelligence services of Ukraine and NATO countries may have orchestrated the attacks. He provided no evidence to back up his accusation. And when the pro-Kremlin news site Komsomolskaya Pravda reported on events in Dagestan and accused the collective West of trying to open a second front against Russia. The writer continued, when it comes to unrest in this region, traditionally it's the ears of British intelligence that stick out. Blaming Ukraine and the West, it reminds me of official Russian reaction to a mass shooting back in March. More than 140 people have been killed after gunmen stormed the Crocus City concert hall near Moscow. The Russian authorities pointed the finger of blame at Kiev and Western countries, even though ISIS, or whatever they want to be called now, had already claimed responsibility for the attack and released video of it. Now, interestingly enough, first off, the mentioning of the Moscow attack is there, right, which was people from Tajikistan, by the way, which we have Tajiks being arrested here in the U.S. for having possible terror ties. Just throwing that out there to remind you that that's something that we have going on here. But the other thing to keep in mind is that they're claiming that that was claimed by ISIS, right, the attack there at the Crocus City concert hall. And we have this attack going on now that Russia's saying, you know, British intelligence is always, you know, involved in these types of things in that region. And to us, it's easy to kind of just go with like, okay, whatever, BS, right? We know that this region's not stable and things just happen. But we also know, as Americans, we're aware of these things when it comes to things like, you know, ISIS and Al-Qaeda and certain groups being created by the CIA and things just happening then afterward. Like, we know that there's some Western intelligence involved with some of these groups that are now considered our adversaries. And so maybe it's not as far-fetched as one might think, even though I don't necessarily just believe some guy saying it, right? Like, we need evidence, of course. But that's evidence that's hard to find, I'm sure. And intelligence agencies don't generally just leave breadcrumbs for everyone to find after. But we know that they have relationships with some of these entities, or at least we're part of their origin. And so the thing to keep in mind is that we're getting a tit-for-tat scenario thrown at us when it comes to retaliation. We know they blame attacks like this one on Ukraine and NATO and the U.S. when it comes to foreign intelligence services spawning these attacks, or at least maybe provoking them, right? And we know that they are willing to arm our enemies. So I'm just putting it out there that the idea of an asymmetrical style terrorist event happening in the U.S. or maybe at an embassy or just somewhere in Europe, right, with one of our allies, those things become more and more likely as these events keep unfolding. And that's just my opinion because of how high the tension is right now between these major superpowers. And because there's no accountability when it comes to some of the proxy wars that are occurring, right, with us arming Ukraine and then Ukraine killing Russian soldiers, and then now Russia saying, look, they used ATACMS on Crimea, they killed civilians, we're now going to retaliate, and we've been blaming the U.S. for being actually part of this war at this point in time and calling us directly the enemy now. It's just not far-fetched to me that they might stoop to that level, right? Like they might do something similar to what we're seeing happening, at least in those regions when it comes to those types of attacks. And I'm not wanting that to be the case, don't get me wrong, but I'm just prepared for it because I think that it's a possibility, right? So, Cherokee Survival, good to see you. Glad you're here. Round one. My wife and I were watching Unsolved Mysteries a few days ago. I love that show. Well, I love the narrator's voice, I'll tell you that much. I definitely can't compete. Zoomer Prepper, good to see you. Glad you're here. Look, we need the Zoomers here because they got to take over the reins, you know. As long as we get through all this stuff and we actually just grow old and die off eventually, then the Zoomers got to take over. So we're glad you're here. And let's see, I'm really surprised it hasn't gotten much worse by now, says Gunslinger 67. Well, I think that there is some reservations when it comes to what could happen. I think both sides are worried about what that might look like. But I mean, we're just slowly going towards it instead of quickly. So I expect it to get worse. Worsted. Worse. I can't say words. It's fine. Just so everybody knows, if you can't tell by my voice tonight, I may or may not have strep throat. I'm not sure. But one thing I know for sure is that 2 of my kids do. So if that's going on, then, well, I probably do too. Oh, well. Good evening, South Florida DCL. Now, why am I saying that? Well, we have threats being put out there, and we have alarm bells going off when it comes to terror attacks, especially at these high-profile events. And it just seems like something that could easily occur at this point in time. I mean, it's It's just a matter of time at this point, at least in my opinion. Islamist terror attack is top fear for Paris 2024 Olympics, police chief says. There's no clear-cut threat yet against the games, police chief added, okay? Now, this is a story from June 21st. Now, I want to mention, in case you're new here, I generally stick to stories and news that is relevant within the last week because we do a weekly live stream. So I want to make sure to cover things that have happened since the last one. But we sometimes go back further in history in order to build context and to remind you of things that have occurred so you can be more aware of like how these things stack together. So that's kind of my goal here. And if you're here on replay, crew, you're the best. Thank you so much. Make sure you check it in the comments because it's just always nice to see that everyone comes back to actually listen to this information. And hopefully the earlier start time at 8 o'clock Central Standard instead of 8:30 is helping some of you get into the live a little easier because I know that it was a little late for some people and I'm trying my best to kind of accommodate, right? The threat of an Islamist terror attack is keeping top officials awake at night, just weeks ahead of the 2024 Olympics kicking off in Paris. Islamist terrorism remains our main concern. Laurent Nunez, chief of police in French capital, told a press conference on Friday. By the way, I just want to throw this out there. In France, Islamist terrorism remains our main concern. In the United States, it's people who vote for Donald Trump, and it's people who are veterans, and it's people who are prepared, right? And that's at least what our authorities are saying. So just keep that in mind because that's just where we're at now, and I'm just throwing it out there as a reminder to how our government is thinking compared to others, I guess. Nunez added, there's no clear-cut threat yet against the games in our country, but I'd like to remind you that at the end of May, 2 individuals were arrested in Saint Etienne and were plotting a project aimed directly at the Olympic Games, which, by the way, we went over that plot in a previous live stream. France has been on high alert amid concerns over potential terrorist acts as Paris prepares to host the Olympic Games, which will start on July 26th and end on August 11th. In March, France scaled down the River Seine opening ceremony with 104,000 spectators, now expected to enjoy the celebrations on the waterfront, and 222,000 others watching from bridges and streets, dwindling from 600,000 total floated by the French government back in 2022. The terrorist threat remains just as important as the protest threat posed by radical environmental groups, the ultra-left, and the pro-Palestinian movement, Police Chief Nunez added. That is not how this article would go in the U.S. right now. I can't ignore that. I'm sorry. And I don't care about your ideology or political alignment or anything like that. We all should be on the same page here that as Americans, we do not want terrorist activity happening in our country, no matter who's at fault. But it's clearly a different thought process when it comes to one country and another. And it's not like France is a bastion of alternative viewpoints when it comes to policies, right? So, they're definitely not pro-gun, I'll tell you that much. So here we are. But just wanted to mention that. So obviously these threats and these concerns are real, especially when it comes to high-profile events. Now, one thing from that article that kind of caught my attention that I thought maybe you should consider, one of the viewing areas of these hundreds of thousands of spectators was bridges, right? We've seen what's happened to some bridges here lately in the country. Bridges have always been a target when it comes to terrorist activity or even when it comes to conventional warfare, right? I mean, we've seen what's happened to the Crimean Bridge over and over again. And I don't think I personally would be one of the hundreds of thousands of people standing on a bridge during the opening ceremony of the Olympics this year. That's just my opinion. If you're in France, maybe consider that. Maybe just keep that in mind, right? I would. That's just me. So, now, another way to keep in mind, or another thing to keep in mind, because a way of doing it, isn't really worth it, but a thing to keep in mind is that Russia recently threatened to arm our enemies, and it sounds like they just are now. Now, this wasn't exactly what I assumed they were alluding to, but it's definitely part of the equation. I'm sure they have more plans in place to do something similar to this, but my honest thought process and belief was that they're going to arm proxy groups similar to Hezbollah or Hamas or the Houthis, right? These different groups that are militant but not necessarily related to a state, right? But we're starting with North Korea. With its new pact with North Korea, Russia raises the stakes with the West over Ukraine. Behind the smiles, the balloons, and the red carpet pageantry of President Vladimir Putin's visit to North Korea last week, a strong signal came through. In the spiraling confrontation with the U.S. and its allies over Ukraine, the Russian leader is willing to challenge Western interests like never before. The pact he signed with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un envisions mutual military assistance between Moscow and Pyongyang. If either is attacked, Putin also announced for the first time that Russia could provide weapons to the isolated country, a move that could destabilize the Korean peninsula and reverberate far beyond. Now, keep in mind that part of the problem here is that if there was a conflict between North and South Korea, Russia is basically telling North Korea now that, hey, well, we would give you weapons if that happens. And that gives North Korea more confidence in waging war in that theater. So keep that in mind, because this just raises the possibility of those things happening. It doesn't necessarily mean something is going to happen, but the probability of it is higher, right? So he described the potential arms shipments as a response to NATO allies providing Ukraine with longer-range weapons to attack Russia. He bluntly declared that Moscow has nothing to lose and is prepared to go to the end to achieve its goals in Ukraine. Okay, that tells you some stuff. Putin's moves added to concerns in Washington and Seoul about what they see as an alliance in which North Korea provides Moscow with badly needed munitions for its war in Ukraine in exchange for economic assistance and technology transfers that would enhance the threat posed by Kim's nuclear weapons and missile program. So, I mean, this is big. And look, North Korea has nuclear weapons. So Russia providing them with more nuclear weapons wouldn't really necessarily make a huge impact about the sense of them being a nuclear country, but it would grow their armory, which is problematic, right? Last month, Putin warned that Russia could provide long-range weapons to others to hit Western targets in response to NATO allies, allowing Ukraine to use its allies' arms to make limited attacks inside Russian territory. We know who he's talking about. He followed up on that warning Thursday with an explicit threat to provide weapons to North Korea. I wouldn't exclude that in view of our agreements with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Putin said, adding that Moscow could mirror the arguments by NATO allies that it's up to Ukraine to decide how to use Western weapons. We can similarly say that we supply something to somebody but have no control over what happens afterward, Putin said. Let them think about it. So keep that in mind too. Here's some nuclear weapons. Where did they go? Well, it's not really up to us because, we don't have control over it after we give them to them. We don't have control over any of this technology that we gave them once they have it. Who knows why Iran suddenly has nuclear weapons or the capability to produce them more easily, right? So these are all things to keep in mind. This is escalation. It's balanced escalation in the sense of it not necessarily changing a lot about the current war, but it's changing the future of how things have to be handled based on these relationships existing. And now that we know modern warfare, if we're going to study Ukraine, for example, or even if you want to look into the Gaza situation, modern warfare is clearly a war of attrition in many ways. And so having access to additional munitions and having access to better technology and having a large foreign entity that's willing to provide you with those munitions is almost a necessity at this point in time, okay? So, that happened, okay? It's not good, but it is something that these countries are doing. And I believe I just saw a report recently that Serbia is asking to join the BRICS nations as well now. And we have to understand that this whole global order seems to be reorganizing to a degree. And that's probably not in our best interests, right? So, and whether or not we had theirs in mind isn't really our concern anymore because we probably did not, right? I mean, obviously. But we have definitely benefited from it and will likely not benefit from the opposite. So you just have to consider that. It's not comfortable, but it's true, right? So why is this a problem? So here's one thing I want to keep in mind. Russia is saying it will retaliate for the attack in Sevastopol, okay? Because U.S. ATACMS missiles were used in the attack. This is what Russia said 3 weeks ago, right? Or a little less than 3 weeks ago. Putin threatens to arm West's enemies with long-range missiles. The threatened tit for tat comes as Russia is expected to deploy warships and aircraft in the Caribbean, right? So we know what happened in Cuba. They sent the sub down there. They sent the warships down there. It created a big stir. everything else, right? This or that. Here's the thing. This was 3 weeks ago. They said this, and now 3 weeks later, they're in North Korea saying, yeah, we're going to give you weapons. So it sounds like they're following through on their threats now. Whereas in the past, maybe there wasn't as much follow through. And that's where some of my concerns come into play, because I don't think they're just talking anymore. And so them saying that retaliation is basically imminent, right, when it comes to this attack in Sevastopol, and the retaliation is against the U.S. specifically, we have to assume they're going to do something. Because this at least provides us with a roadmap that they made a threat and then followed through with it thereafter. So what are they going to follow through with now? And the examples that I've given you so far tonight and the things that we've discussed, especially related to the asymmetric stuff when it comes to the possibility of provoking terrorist activities and things of that nature, that's what I'm most concerned about in the sense of it affecting my life directly, because it could happen anywhere at any time. And as someone who's prepared, like a prepared citizen, likely, maybe you're concealed carrying, or maybe you at least just have some form of protection, or even if it's just pepper spray, right? Whatever you got in your mind, you should be moving through your day with a higher level of situational awareness, and you should have evacuation plans put together when it comes to your daily routine, right? So if you're going to work every day and that's what you do all the time, how would you leave there if something was happening in the way that you usually go, right? Was there a way around? You know the back roads. Do you have alternate routes? Do you have a level of safety with you when it comes to something happening at your workplace, right? Like, these are all things you should be considering now as being a heightened risk scenario, and how you'll respond to that possible scenario occurring. That's just my suggestion, right? The economic stuff that Russia could possibly do isn't probably going to affect us directly, or at least not easily seen. But it is something that I find to be one of the most likely approaches that we'll probably have to expect here, because it's the least escalatory, and I don't know if that's what Russia really wants right this minute, right? Direct conflict, but we can't rule it out. We just can't. So we also have a new Warfront opening up. What does that mean for us? Well, it means that this global catastrophe, is what we'll call it at this point, is continuing to move forward. It's not de-escalating. Peace talks aren't working out too well. People aren't calming down, which means that there is a propensity for things to escalate further, right? So right now we have the situation happening between Israel and Lebanon. So we're going to touch on that. And it could easily pull the U.S. into it, which is why we have to look at these types of things occurring as well. Netanyahu, Israeli forces will move to Lebanon border as Rafah winds down. So what this looks like to me, based on the information within the article, is that now that Israel is pretty confident at what they've accomplished in Gaza, right, based on their opinion, they're now going to move to the next front, which looks to be Lebanon with Hezbollah. And that's a much broader conflict, which we're going to talk about here in just a second, because Hezbollah may as well be Iran, right? So like we're in a this thing's growing. We don't want it to grow. We want it to shrink. It's getting out of hand. It's going to get further out of hand, apparently. Israel's prime minister has said the intense phase of fighting Hamas in Gaza is nearly over, allowing forces to move to the northern border with Lebanon to confront its ally, Hezbollah. In his first Israeli media interview since the start of the war in October, Benjamin Netanyahu said he expected the ground operation in the southern city of Gaza, southern Gaza city of Rafah, to be completed soon. But he stressed that that doesn't mean the war is about to end, with action continuing until Hamas was completely driven from power. Addressing the escalating hostilities with Hezbollah, which have raised fears of a wider regional war, he said, "We can fight on several fronts and we are prepared to do that." Sounds like they are going to do that. Hezbollah has been launching missiles, rockets, and drones into northern Israel in support of Hamas since the day after the 7th October attacks in southern Israel, when gunmen from Gaza killed about 1,200 people and took 251 others as hostages. More than 37,620 people have been killed in Gaza during the military campaign that Israel launched in response, according to the Palestinian Territories Hamas-run health ministry. Mr. Netanyahu suggested in his interview with Israeli Channel 14 TV on Sunday that the 7-week Israeli operation in Rafah, which has displaced more than 1 million Palestinians, would be the last major offensive of the war. The intense phase of the fighting against Hamas is about to end. It doesn't mean that the war is is about to end, but the war is in its intense phase is about to end in Rafah. Israeli forces will continue mowing the grass all the time, he added. We will not give up. Okay. They're done there, which means they're going to the next place. Now, let's talk about the next place and how this could get out of control really quickly. And how we're probably going to get involved, because that's just how this works. Okay? Thousands of Iran-backed fighters offered to join Hezbollah in its fight against Israel. Thousands of Iran-backed fighters. They're growing their ranks, or at least willing to grow their ranks in anticipation of this war. This is what you expect to see before a war, right? Mobilization. It has to happen. We saw it before Russia invaded Ukraine. We're seeing it now. The expectation should be at this point that there will be a war between Lebanon and Israel. And the other thing to keep in mind, well, between Hezbollah, which is Lebanon basically. So here we are. But the other thing to keep in mind is that, we're going to be involved. And because of that, we have to be aware that this is going to just get worse. Thousands of fighters from Iran-backed groups in the Middle East are ready to come to Lebanon to join with the militant Hezbollah group in its battle with Israel if the simmering conflict escalates into a full-blown war, officials with Iran-backed factions and analysts say. Almost daily exchanges of fire have occurred along Lebanon's frontier with northern Israel since fighters from the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip staged a bloody assault on southern Israel in early October that set off a war in Gaza. They always have to mention that, by the way. Here's the thing else that I want you to remember. From what I've seen, and I've seen reporting on this, and it has some validity based on other conflicts we've seen. There's been a lot of evacuations and countries trying to get their citizens out of Lebanon as of recent. That's another indication of a war about to happen. So these things are all adding up. These are all red flags of conflict, and we're seeing all of them go off. So you should just expect this war to occur. The situation to the north worsened this month after an Israeli airstrike killed a senior Hezbollah military commander in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah retaliated by firing hundreds of rockets and explosive drones into northern Israel. Israeli officials have threatened a military offensive in Lebanon if there's no negotiated end to push Hezbollah away from the border. Over the past decade, Iran-backed fighters from Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan fought together in Syria's 13-year conflict, helping tip the balance in favor of Syrian President Bashar Assad. Officials from Iran-backed groups say they could also join together again against Israel. And in case you don't remember that civil war in Syria, that whole deal? The side of resistance against Bashar Assad became ISIS, right? And they were backed by the West. And they were armed by the West. So these are things to keep in mind. Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah said in a speech Wednesday that militant leaders from Iran, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and other countries have previously offered to send tens of thousands of fighters to help Hezbollah. But he said the group already has more than 100,000 fighters. We told them thank you, but we are overwhelmed by the numbers we have, Nasrallah said. Nasrallah said the battle in its current form is using only a portion of Hezbollah's manpower, an apparent reference to the specialized fighters who fire missiles and drones. But that could change in the event of an all-out war. Nasrallah hinted at the possibility in a speech in 2017 in which he said fighters from Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Pakistan will be partners of such a war. Now, if this war breaks out, which all the indicators are kind of showing that it probably will, and this happens, when you get Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Afghanistan, and Pakistan involved, does that expand the current global conflict? Like that's a question to ask yourself. Does that expand the conflict into more countries, into more participants? This whole deal, Russia, Israel, everything is just growing out of control. And we also have China, right? And we know China is making moves around Taiwan. I mean, they popped a nuclear sub up there just the other day just to say hi and let them know that they could. So don't expect China to just sit idly by, right? They are highly involved in a lot of what's happening. Just not as forwardly about it. So this is where things are going right now, right? We're in a wartime environment. It's not the best. I don't like it, but here we are. So let me get back in the chat for a second here. Have you looked into or heard of the Rivada Outernet, Declan, Ganley, and EU Defense Network? Seems interesting topic if any of this happens. You know, I have not. So, and I'm not afraid to say I don't know things. So I haven't. So I will look into that just because it's piquing my interest right now, right? I have no idea what that is, but I will take a look. Let's see here. What's the average age of a Ukrainian soldier now, says Mark Burrell. I don't know, but I know it's older than it was 2 years ago. Let's see here. When SHTF, all the freeloaders are going to be peeved when their debit cards aren't getting reloaded quickly. Well, and that's the thing. So something to consider is that the average person is not prepared. And the average person's not prepared like to any degree. Might not even have a proper phone charger, right? Like there's people out there who charge their phone at work because they don't have a dongle at home and they don't have a USB port, so they just charge it. You know what I mean? Like that's how unprepared some people are. So those people are going to have a bad time, but they're going to make their bad time your problem too. And that's why community is important, because you need more than just one person to deal with the golden horde, right? But you also need some level of compassion too to maintain a level of morality, but also to hopefully help those people get to where they don't become so desperate, right? So like we're in a tough spot. And we all know that the comment there, Desert 1776, about the freeloader situation, the strategy there is to prevent unrest, right? Like that's just all it comes down to. It's built out of a certain level of laziness in many ways. Now, of course, there are people who are definitely needing the assistance, and I understand that. It should be temporary, don't get me wrong. There are people who need it. It just is what it is. I don't know what to say. But there are a lot who don't. And those people are going to be problematic. But if we can get those people figured out beforehand, it'll be a lot easier for us, right? So it's a tough spot. It's a tough spot. But it certainly is a way to maintain control and to keep unrest to a minimum, right? So, Black Cat Whirligig, I appreciate you. Thanks for being here. Now, I want to mention, we do have some strike group movement going on. Carrier strike group movement is something you can pay attention to if you want to see what level of escalation you're anticipating, right? So what do I mean by that? Well, right now we have some rotations occurring. So if these strike groups are rotating, then we expect that to kind of maintain status quo. If they are expanding, then you have a good indication that things are about to get crazy. So if you have one strike group in the Middle East right now, and it's leaving and being replaced by another, we're status quo. If you have one strike group there right now and another joins, now we're in a different scenario, right? So, just so you guys are aware, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower is sailing out of the waters of the Middle East after 8 months of skirmishes and fights with Houthi militants over the waters around Yemen. The aircraft carrier and the 3 ships that make it a strike group are now set to head into the European theater before eventually sailing back to the United States, U.S. Central Command confirmed in a statement on X. Which, by the way, is interesting because they've been deployed for a long time, 8 months straight, right? And instead of just going back home, they're going to Europe first. So there is an indication there of some concern of not wanting them to just not be around in case they're needed suddenly, right? So just keep that in mind, throwing that out there as something you could take a look at. The Carrier Strike Group had previously had its deployment extended, most recently in May. The Ike, as it is known, and its Carrier Strike Group, including a Carrier Air Wing, was sent to the waters around the Middle East in October, obviously during that whole situation, okay? So, it has left the USS Gerald R. Ford and its carrier group, which was also dispatched to the waters around the Middle East in October after the start of the Israeli-Gaza war, wrapped up its deployment in January, okay? Now, this is going back to Europe, and in fact, it has already arrived. So just be aware that maybe they're just a buffer as of right now. Ike Carrier Strike Group arrives in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. This was from just a few hours ago when this article was published. Components of the Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, Nimitz-class aircraft carrier, arrived in the Eastern Mediterranean after an 8-month deployment, according to the U.S. Fifth Fleet Area of Operations. Okay, so it tells you all about it right here. Now, it might just be there for some kind of, administrative reason. I don't know. All I'm saying is that because it's in Europe, it could be a buffer because of this retaliation situation that we're talking about. Maybe, I don't know. But I do know that we aren't leaving the Middle East completely. And that's something else that you should keep in mind, because these movements kind of tell you like where the Navy's thoughts are, where they need to be, right? Where they're needed is probably where things aren't good. So USS Theodore Roosevelt, the U.S. Navy's second busiest aircraft carrier to roar amid Indo-Pacific Red Sea threats, okay? So right now, this was actually stationed in the Korean Peninsula. The aircraft carrier arrived ahead of the trilateral Freedom Edge military exercises, which are scheduled near the Korean Peninsula and involve South Korea, Japan, and the United States. The joint military exercises are a direct result of an agreement reached by the defense chiefs of three nations before Russian President Vladimir Putin's high-profile visit to Pyongyang, right? So that was all here. That's why they were there. But it's going to the Middle East. Following the completion of its planned exercises in the Indo-Pacific region, the USS Theodore Roosevelt will depart for the Middle East to replace the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group. The Eisenhower, often referred to as Ike, left the region on June 22nd after a grueling mission combating Yemen's Houthi forces. These forces have been disrupting shipping lanes in the Red Sea in support of Palestinians. The Pentagon confirmed that the Eisenhower will briefly remain in the U.S.-European Command Area before returning home after an over 7-month deployment. The Eisenhower Carrier Strike Group, well, we already talked about that. The USS Theodore Roosevelt, the second busiest aircraft carrier in the past 5 years, will soon leave the Indo-Pacific. The deployment emphasizes the U.S. commitment to maintaining a robust presence in the region. The United States will continue to maintain a robust presence in the Indo-Pacific region to strengthen peace, stability, and deterrence alongside allies and partners. Okay? So, the Roosevelt's going to the Middle East. The duration of its mission is uncertain. Probably because we have no idea how long things are going to be bad there. Rushanel Van, if the U.S. officially gets involved in a war or there's a strike on U.S. soil, do you think civil war would also break out in the U.S. considering the political climate? Seems like a perfect storm. Well, here's the thing, and thanks for the super chat, by the way. I appreciate it. My opinion on it is that civil war in the U.S. would be the best case scenario for our adversaries. They would love to see that. And in fact, I am 100% certain of the fact that they have instigators and collaborators on the ground right now trying to incite it. They are part of that scenario. They're part of the division in this country. They're also, in our own government in ways. I said it. It's true. I don't care. But yes, I don't know if it would start a civil war. There's a good possibility that it could create a rallying cry back to patriotism, similar to what we saw after 9/11, right? You could see people get a little bit more on the same page when it comes to, wanting to defend and protect the United States. But the collaborators and instigators on the ground here would probably try their best to create an insightful and just egregious situation. Right? With protests about whatever war moves might be made, with large groups getting out there and demonstrating and just creating maybe even more of an anti-American type protest versus what we've seen in the past, which could then obviously create a lot of tension with pro or patriotic American groups, which would then be a good catalyst for things to really move into a new territory. So I don't assume there would be a civil war type scenario based on a foreign adversary attacking us. I would hope, in fact, that it might create the opposite effect. But I wouldn't rule it out because I think that they would benefit from it, which means they would probably try to instigate it in one way or another, right? Which is a lot of the division you see right now. Even when it comes to Russia and Ukraine and how it's being handled, some of that is done through foreign adversaries trying to divide us even on those different conversations, right? Because they don't want us to be able to agree on things, because how do you move forward very easily then? And that's why some of these more authoritarian countries can just do these things, because they don't have people questioning them, right? But in the United States, like, we couldn't just go invade Mexico and take over the land and just be like, well, it used to be ours, I guess we're saying anyway, and now we're going to say more of it's ours. And which, is obviously not true, but I'm just saying, like, that would be similar to what Russia did to Ukraine. And the American people would be like, whoa, what's happening? Like, this ain't right, and there would be a whole different situation. So that's just my thought on it. Now, The dude says you can't starve us out and you can't make us run. I like it. Some of us are country boys, and that's just how it works. Personally, I'm not, even though I live in the country. I will fully admit that I was raised in the suburbs, so I'm not going to try to pretend to be something I'm not. Do I enjoy things that are country in fashion? I have my enjoyments, you better believe it. So, be prepared. Get ready for things to really spiral out of control. I think this entire situation is going to get out of hand, regardless of whether or not it's from Europe or from the Middle East. It's just not getting better. It's just getting worse. And I also want to mention that we as preppers just don't really get to decide what happens. We have to react to it. It's unfortunate. Being reactionary is not as easy as being, proactive. But you can be proactive in having preparedness plans in place and having supplies and sustainability methods ready to go, so that way you can deal with this situation as best you can when it arrives. But you can't assume that you can really change what's going to happen, right? Like, we all know that by now. Like, we're not the people pulling the strings. We're not privy to that. But we are able to take care of our situation, our personal area, and our community to a degree, depending on how large yours is, and then hope for the best, right? So, I'm doing what I can. I hope you are too. I really appreciate every single one of you here being on the live stream tonight. It's been very enjoyable, and the information I hope you found to be worthy of your time. And if it was, I would hope that you'd hit the subscribe button, hit the bell notification, maybe the like button. Help me get the channel out there, because for some reason, right, I don't want to speculate, but for some reason things have been a little tougher than usual. So I'm just trying my best to kind of fight the good fight, right? And then if you want to be in the private live stream that starts tonight at 9:15 Central Standard Time, you can hit the join button below and join the YouTube channel membership, and you'll have access to the private live stream. It's just a casual format. We just hang out, we chat about stuff. And it's honestly just, if you want to support the channel, it's my way of saying thank you and trying to provide something for doing so. And you can also join the Subscribe Star if you're interested in that. It's $5 a month, but it does have some additional content as well as some preparedness incentives, which we're going to talk about tonight in the private live stream. But I do honestly appreciate you just being here. So if you all are just even here, I'm already happy, 100%. So thank you all. I will let you get going, and, well, in all honesty, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.